Snow was falling, but the children at St. Jude's weren't looking at the sky. They were staring at a smouldering pile of ash that used to be their Christmas. Someone had burned their gifts to the ground. They thought they had won. Then the Hells Angels made a phone call. The winter of 1998 hit the Rust Belt town of Oakhaven with a brutality that chilled the bones. The factories had mostly closed, the streets were lined with greying snow, and hope was a commodity in shorter supply than heating oil. But inside the walls of St. Jude's Home for Children, there was a warmth that the biting wind couldn't touch. Director Thomas Callahan, a man whose deeply lined face told the story of 30 years spent fighting for forgotten kids, had pulled off a miracle. St. Jude's was chronically underfunded. The radiators hissed and banged, the roof leaked in the spring, and the state board was constantly threatening to shut them down. Yet, for the past 3 months, Thomas had tirelessly campaigned on local radio stations, stood outside grocery stores, and knocked on the doors of local businesses. He had organized the biggest toy drive in the county's history. By December 22nd, the detached, aluminum-sided gymnasium at the back of the Orphanage property was packed to the rafters. There were shiny red Schwinn bicycles lined up like soldiers, mountains of wrapped boxes, porcelain dolls, remote-controlled cars, and most importantly, heavy winter coats for all 42 children living in the home. For 7-year-old Lily, who had arrived at St. Jude's in October, clutching a torn garbage bag holding all her worldly possessions, the promise of Christmas was overwhelming. She had never received a wrapped present in her life. Thomas had caught her peeking through the frosted windows of the gymnasium the night before, her breath pluming in the freezing air, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy. "They're for you, Lily," Thomas had whispered, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "All of them. For you and the others. Santa didn't forget you." But monsters don't care about Christmas. It happened at 2:14 a.m. on December 23rd. The fire alarm inside the main house shrieked to life, jolting Thomas from his sleep. He threw on his boots, not even bothering with a coat, and bolted into the hallway. The children were already spilling out of their rooms, terrified, clutching thin blankets. But the fire wasn't in the main house. The orange glow bleeding through the windows was coming from the backyard. The gymnasium was an inferno. The flames roared into the pitch-black sky, a swirling vortex of heat and destruction. By the time the local fire department sirens wailed in the distance, the roof of the gym had already collapsed in a shower of sparks. Thomas stood in the knee-deep snow, holding little Lily tightly against his chest to shield her from the searing heat, tears freezing on his cheeks. He watched helplessly as the bicycles melted, as the coats turned to ash, as the mountain of dreams he had built for these children was reduced to a blackened, smoking crater. Morning broke over Oakhaven with a cruel grey light. The smoke still hung heavy in the air, carrying the sickening toxic smell of burned plastic and scorched rubber. Fire Chief Miller stood by the ruins, his face grim, turning a charred metallic object over in his thick gloves. He walked over to where Thomas was sitting on the back steps of the main house, his head in his hands. "Thomas," the chief said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I need you to look at this." He held out the object. It was the melted remains of a heavy-duty master padlock. "It was cut," the chief explained. "Bolt cutters. And that's not all. My boys found the remnants of 2 steel gasoline canisters in the brush by the fence line. This wasn't faulty wiring, Thomas. This was intentional. Someone torched this place on purpose." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow to the stomach. "Who?" Who would burn the Christmas gifts of orphans? The terrible realization began to dawn on him. For months, a predatory real estate developer named Richard Kincaid had been aggressively trying to buy the land St. Jude sat on. Kincaid Enterprises was planning a massive luxury condominium development, and the orphanage was the last holdout blocking the project. Kincaid had sent lawyers. He had sent eviction notices based on obscure zoning technicalities, and recently the threats had become less legal and more physical. Broken windows, vandalized transport vans. This fire wasn't just cruelty, it was a message. Leave, or the main house is next. By noon, the story had broken on the local news. The reporter stood in front of the blackened wreckage, her voice trembling as she described the utter devastation. The camera panned to the children, their faces pressed against the frosty glass of the dining room window, looking out at the ruins of their Christmas. Little Lily was shown holding a half-melted wheel of a toy truck she had found in the snow. The town of Oakhaven was outraged, but paralyzed. The police chief told Thomas they had no hard evidence tying Kincaid to the arson. The local thugs Kincaid used for his dirty work were ghosts, slipping back into the shadows of the city's underbelly. The community was heartbroken, but there was no time to rebuild. Christmas was 48 hours away. The orphanage was devastated, broken, and terrified. They thought Kincaid had won. They thought no one was coming to save them. They were wrong. 20 miles away, on the industrial outskirts of the city, a neon sign buzzed ominously in the daylight. The Iron Horse Saloon. Behind the heavy steel doors lay the fortified clubhouse of the local Hells Angels charter. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of stale beer, and the heavy scent of saddle leather. The men who occupied this space were not the type of people polite society invited to dinner. They were massive, heavily tattooed, clad in grease-stained denim and black leather cuts bearing the infamous Death's Head patch. They lived by their own code, entirely outside the bounds of traditional law and order. Bobby Jenkins, the president of the charter, sat at the head of the scarred wooden bar. Bobby was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with a wild, graying beard, arms the size of tree trunks, and a gaze that could make a state trooper nervously look away. He was sipping black coffee, quietly going over a ledger, while the small television mounted in the corner of the bar hummed with the midday news. Next to him sat his sergeant-at-arms, a man known simply as Bear, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone, and Dutch, the charter's vice president, who was meticulously cleaning the spark plugs of his Harley-Davidson shovelhead. "Police are calling it a deliberate act of arson," the news anchor's voice cut through the low rumble of the clubhouse. Bobby paused, his pen hovering over the ledger. He slowly raised his head, his eyes locking onto the television screen. The camera showed the smoking ruins of the St. Jude's gymnasium. It showed the melted toys. And then, it showed the faces of the children. It showed Thomas Callahan, a man broken, desperately trying to hold back tears as he explained that 42 orphans would wake up to absolutely nothing on Christmas morning. The clubhouse, usually a cacophony of loud laughter, clinking glasses, and heavy metal music, went dead silent. The grinding of Bear's whetstone stopped. Dutch lowered his wrench. Every man in the room was staring at the screen. In the outlaw biker world, there are lines you cross and lines you don't. You war with rival clubs, you fight the cops, you hustle to survive. But you never touch kids. To these men, many of whom had grown up in broken homes, foster care, or on the streets themselves, the abuse of a child was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Bobby stared at the screen, a terrifying, quiet fury building behind his dark eyes. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just calmly set his pen down on the bar. "Turn it up," Bobby commanded. His voice was dangerously low, a rumbling baritone that carried absolute authority. The bartender scrambled to crank the volume. The news report mentioned the suspected ties to local real estate intimidation, hinting at Richard Kincaid's name, though the reporter was careful not to make direct accusations without police evidence. The police spokesperson then came on, giving the standard bureaucratic line. "We are investigating all leads, but currently have no suspects in custody." Bobby picked up his flip phone. He flipped it open and dialed a single number. The silence in the bar was absolute. Everyone knew what was happening. When Bobby Jenkins made this specific call, the earth moved. "Yeah, it's Bobby." He spoke into the receiver, his voice ice cold. "You watching Channel 8? Good. Call the brothers, all of them. Get the prospects to warm up the bikes. We're locking down the city." He snapped the phone shut and turned to face his men. The air in the room crackled with a violent, focused energy. "Some suits and street rats think they can burn down an orphanage to make a buck," Bobby said, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of every hardened biker. "The cops are going to file paperwork. We are not. We find the matches. We break the hands." Within 30 minutes, the heavy steel doors of the clubhouse rolled open. A deafening, thundering roar echoed across the industrial park as 50 Harley-Davidsons roared to life. It was a mechanical symphony of wrath. They rode out in perfect formation, a heavy black leather cavalry cutting through the freezing snow. Their first stop wasn't the police station. It wasn't the orphanage. It was the streets. The Hells Angels didn't need warrants to get information. They knew the underbelly of the city better than the police ever could. Bobby dispatched his crew to every dive bar, every chop shop, and every illicit gambling den in Oakhaven. Bear and Dutch kicked in the door of a seedy pool hall in the South End, a known hangout for local muscle for hire. The music screeched to a halt. The patrons froze as the two massive bikers stepped into the dim light, the heavy chains on their boots clinking against the hardwood floor. Bear walked straight up to a low-level enforcer named Jimmy Farrell. Jimmy was a known associate of Richard Kincaid, the kind of guy who threw bricks through windows for a couple of $100. Jimmy took one look at Bear's face and tried to bolt for the back exit. He didn't make it 3 steps. Dutch grabbed Jimmy by the scruff of his jacket, lifting him entirely off the ground, and slammed him against the brick wall with a sickening thud. The pool hall remained completely silent. Nobody moved to help him. "Let's have a chat, Jimmy," Bear said casually, stepping into Jimmy's personal space, his shadow completely enveloping the terrified thug. "Word on the street is you've been doing some freelance work for a guy named Kincaid, handing out eviction notices with a lighter." "I don't know what you're talking about, man, I swear," Jimmy stammered, his eyes darting frantically. Bear didn't blink. He slowly reached into his leather cut and pulled out a Zippo lighter. He flipped it open with a sharp clack, the flame illuminating his scarred face. He held it an inch from Jimmy's nose. "You know what happens to rats who burn down kids' toys?" Bear whispered, the threat hanging in the air like poison. "They tend to catch fire themselves. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. Who held the matches, Jimmy?" Jimmy broke. The terror of the police was one thing. The reality of the Hells Angels standing in front of him was entirely another. He spilled everything. It was a crew of 3 local guys. Kincaid had paid them $5,000 to torch the gym, to scare the director into selling. He even gave up the location where the arsonists were currently laying low, celebrating their payday, an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Bear snapped the Zippo shut. "Good boy." Within 10 minutes, The thunder returned. The pack of 50 motorcycles converged on the docks, the roar of their engines vibrating the icy pavement. They didn't knock. Bobby Jenkins drove his shovelhead straight through the rotting wooden doors of the warehouse, the front tire smashing the wood into splinters. The rest of the club poured in behind him, encircling the 3 thugs who had been sitting around a Swiss heater, counting Kincaid's cash. The men scrambled to their feet, reaching for weapons, but they were surrounded by a wall of leather, iron, and silent, seething fury. There was no escape. Bobby dismounted his bike, moving with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. He walked toward the ringleader, a wiry man with a rat-like face. Bobby looked down at the stacks of cash on the table, then back up to the trembling arsonist. "You like fire?" Bobby asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous warehouse. The man couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, realizing that his life, as he knew it, was effectively over. "You burned the coats," Bobby continued, stepping closer, the scent of motor oil and cold wind rolling off him. "You burned the dolls. You took a little girl's Christmas, and you burned it to ash." Bobby's massive hand shot out, grabbing the man by the throat. He didn't squeeze to kill, but to assert absolute dominance. He dragged the man to his knees, forcing him to look at the Hell's Angels surrounding him. "Here's the deal," Bobby said, looking down at the pathetic figures. "You're going to call your boss, Kincaid. You're going to tell him you got caught. And then we are going to have a little lesson in restitution." The twist of fate was brutal and swift. The Hell's Angels didn't kill them. Death would have been too easy. They had a much more poetic punishment in mind, one that would solve St. Jude's problem permanently. But the night was far from over, and Bobby Jenkins still had 42 children who needed a Christmas miracle. And if Santa couldn't deliver it on a sleigh, the angels were going to deliver it on 2 wheels. The rat-faced arsonist, a low-level grifter named Greg, was weeping openly. He clutched the heavy brick of a cellular phone Bobby Jenkins had shoved into his chest. Surrounding him, 50 members of the Hell's Angels stood in dead silence, the only sound the metallic clink of chains and the harsh winter wind howling outside the broken warehouse doors. "Dial him," Bobby ordered, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Put it on speaker." Trembling fingers punched in the numbers. The phone rang 3 times before a smooth, arrogant voice answered on the other end. "I told you not to call me on this line, Greg," Richard Kincaid snapped. "Is the job done or not?" Yeah, Mr. Kincaid," Greg stammered, his eyes darting to Bear, who was idly tapping a heavy steel wrench against his palm. "The orphanage gym is gone. Burned to the ground." "Good. That old fool Callahan will have no choice but to fold now," Kincaid chuckled, a sound that made Bobby's jaw clench so hard it ached. "Your final payment is in the drop box. Don't contact me again." Bobby reached out and pressed the end call button. He then held up a small black cassette recorder he had retrieved from his leather saddlebag, hitting the stop button. The red recording light blinked off. He had Kincaid's admission crystal clear on tape. "Bear, Dutch," Bobby said, turning to his lieutenants. "Take our 3 fire starters here downtown. Tie them to the flagpole out front of the precinct. Tape the rest of Kincaid's cash to their chests with a little note for Detective Harrison. Let the cops have their collar." "What about you, boss?" Dutch asked, a dangerous grin spreading across his face. "I'm going to pay a visit to a real estate developer," Bobby replied, pulling his leather gloves on tight. "It's time to talk about restitution." 45 minutes later, Richard Kincaid was sitting in his plush, mahogany-paneled office on the top floor of the Kincaid Enterprises building. He was pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, celebrating what he believed was the final nail in the coffin for St. Jude's. He didn't hear the elevator ding. He didn't hear his 2 private security guards hit the marble floor of the lobby after being swiftly incapacitated by blunt force trauma. The heavy oak doors to his office suddenly shattered inward, the wood splintering off the hinges. Kincaid dropped his crystal tumbler, the scotch staining his expensive Persian rug. Standing in the doorway were Bobby Jenkins, flanked by 4 of the largest, most intimidating men Kincaid had ever seen. They smelled of exhaust, cold air, and violence. "What is the meaning of this?" Kincaid shouted, scrambling backward behind his massive desk. "I'm calling the police!" Bobby walked slowly across the room, ignoring the threat entirely. He reached Kincaid's desk, swept a very expensive computer monitor off the edge with the back of his hand, and leaned in close. "You can call the cops, Richard," Bobby said quietly, placing the small cassette recorder on the polished wood. He hit play. Kincaid's own voice filled the room, confirming the arson. Kincaid went pale. The arrogance instantly drained from his face, replaced by naked, suffocating terror. He knew who the Hells Angels were. Everyone in Oakhaven did. He knew that his expensive lawyers couldn't protect him from the men standing in this room. "You're going to jail, Richard." "That's a given," Bobby stated, his eyes boring into Kincaid's soul. "The cops have your boys, and soon they'll have this tape. But how you spend your time before the cops get here, and whether you ever walk with both legs again, depends entirely on what happens in the next 3 minutes. What do you want?" Kincaid whispered, trembling violently. Bobby pulled a crumbled piece of paper from his pocket. "I have a very specific list of demands. First, you will sign over the deed to the property adjacent to St. Jude's, dropping all claims and eviction notices, permanently transferring it to Thomas Callahan's name. Second, you will write a cashier's check for $300,000 for the emotional distress and structural damage you caused. Third, you will hand over $50,000 in untraceable cash from your personal safe, right here, right now." $350,000? Kincaid sputtered, his greed momentarily overriding his fear. "That's extortion." Bear took half a step forward, his hand resting on the large hunting knife strapped to his thigh. "No, Richard," Bobby corrected softly. "Extortion is a crime. This is a charitable donation, and the clock is ticking." Faced with the literal monsters he had unwittingly invited into his life, Kincaid broke. With shaking hands, he opened his floor safe, stacking banded bundles of cash onto the desk. He called his bewildered lawyer to draft an emergency transfer of the deed, and he wrote the check. Bobby scooped the cash into a duffel bag and took the paperwork. He looked down at the ruined, terrified billionaire. "Merry Christmas, Richard," Bobby said. "Don't ever look at an orphanage again." The afternoon of December 24th was a surreal sight in downtown Oakhaven. Arthur Pendleton, the manager of the local Wonderland Toys, was preparing to lock up early for Christmas Eve when the roar of engines shook his front windows. He watched in absolute bewilderment as a convoy of 50 Harley-Davidsons took over his parking lot. Heavy-set men in leather cuts piled into the store. They didn't look at price tags. They didn't browse. "We need 50 winter coats, the heavy-duty ones," Dutch barked at a terrified teenage clerk. "And 20 of those shiny red bicycles. Load 'em in the truck outside." Bobby stood at the register with the duffel bag, tossing stacks of Kincaid's $100 bills onto the counter. They bought remote-controlled trucks, porcelain dolls, train sets, and enough wrapping paper to cover a house. The bikers formed an assembly line, wrapping presents with surprisingly gentle hands in the back of the toy store, their gruff voices debating over which ribbon looked best on a Barbie dream house. By nightfall, they had rented 3 massive box trucks, filling them to the brim. The operation was executed with military precision. The Angels were going to war against despair, and they intended to win. Christmas morning broke over St. Jude's with a bitter, hollow silence. Inside the main dining hall, the 42 children sat at the long wooden tables. There was no running, no laughing, no tearing of paper. Thomas Callahan stood at the head of the room, serving bowls of plain oatmeal. He looked 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. He had tried to put on a brave face, stringing up a few paper chains, but the devastation in the children's eyes was too much to bear. Little Lily sat stirring her oatmeal, looking out the frosted window toward the blackened remains of the gymnasium. "It's okay, Mr. Thomas," Lily said softly, her small voice cutting through the quiet room. "Santa was probably just busy this year." Thomas swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I'm so sorry." Suddenly the floorboards began to vibrate. It started as a low rumble, barely perceptible, like a distant earthquake. Then it grew louder. The glasses on the tables began to clatter. The rattling of the radiator was drowned out by a deafening, mechanical roar. Thomas rushed to the window, his heart in his throat. He thought Kincaid had sent bulldozers, but as he looked out at the snow-covered driveway, his breath caught in his lungs. Leading the pack was a massive black Harley-Davidson, its handlebars wrapped in tinsel, a giant red wreath strapped to the front headlight. Behind it rode 49 more motorcycles, roaring in a V formation, kicking up clouds of white snow. Trailing the thundering pack were 3 large delivery trucks. The children rushed to the windows, their eyes wide with awe as the intimidating cavalry parked in a semicircle around the front lawn. Bobby Jenkins kicked down his kickstand and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. He unstrapped a massive, brightly wrapped box from his bike and walked toward the front doors of the orphanage. The rest of the club followed, pulling open the backs of the trucks. Thomas cautiously opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Thomas asked, entirely unsure of what was happening. Bobby walked up the steps, his imposing frame dwarfing the director. He reached into his leather cut and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He pressed it into Thomas's trembling hands. "What is this?" Thomas asked. "Inside, you'll find the deed to the land this place sits on, signed over to you. Free and clear. Kincaid is out of the picture," Bobby said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "There's also a cashier's check for 300 grand. Build a new gym. Build a better one." Thomas stared at the documents, his knees nearly giving out. I don't understand." "Who are you?" "We're just the delivery boys," Bobby replied. He looked past Thomas, spotting little Lily standing tentatively in the doorway. Bobby dropped down to one knee, the leather of his pants creaking. He held out the massive wrapped box toward the little girl. "I hear a bunch of jerks tried to ruin your Christmas," Bobby said, offering a soft smile that didn't quite match his scarred face. "Santa caught wind of it. He asked us to bring the backups. Is your name Lily?" Lily nodded slowly, her eyes darting from the giant man to the enormous box. "This one has your name on it, kid," Bobby said. Lily reached out and tore a piece of the paper away. Underneath was the edge of a brand-new porcelain doll, the exact one that had been destroyed in the fire. A brilliant, blinding smile broke across her face. Behind Bobby, the Hells Angels began unloading the trucks. Burly, tattooed men carried shiny red bicycles, massive stuffed bears, and heavy winter coats into the dining hall. The orphanage exploded into cheers, laughter, and the chaotic joy of tearing wrapping paper. Bear, a man who had terrified hardened criminals just 24 hours prior, was sitting on the floor, helping a 5-year-old boy put batteries into a remote-controlled car. Dutch was adjusting the helmet on a little girl as she tested out her new bike in the hallway. Thomas Callahan stood on the porch, weeping openly. watching the men society feared most perform a miracle society had failed to provide. The Hells Angels didn't stay for accolades. Once the trucks were empty and every child had a coat and a mountain of toys, Bobby rallied his men. They mounted their iron steeds, the engines roaring back to life, shattering the quiet winter morning once more. As they rode out of the gates, little Lily stood on the porch, clutching her new doll tight against her chest. She waved her small hand at the departing convoy. Bobby Jenkins threw a peace sign over his shoulder before disappearing into the snowy horizon. They were outlaws, criminals in the eyes of the law, and ghosts to polite society. But on that freezing Christmas morning in Oakhaven, they were the closest thing to angels those children would ever see. Sometimes, the greatest protectors don't wear capes. They wear leather and ride on 2 wheels. The Hells Angels proved that while justice might be blind, vengeance for the innocent has a roaring engine. If this incredible story of unlikely heroes and a real-life Christmas miracle moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that good still exists, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, true-to-life stories. The roar of heavily modified Harleys shattered the silence of the Mojave Desert. Locals locked their doors, but when a 300-pound outlaw collapsed from heat stroke on the boiling asphalt, a wheelchair-bound 19-year-old girl made a choice that terrified her mother and triggered a chain of events nobody saw coming. It was mid-July in Needles, California, and the temperature had already crested 112 degrees by noon. The air above Route 66 shimmered with heat waves, distorting the horizon into a watery mirage. Beside a crumbling stretch of asphalt, 19-year-old Hannah Collins sat in her motorized wheelchair under a faded blue pop-up canopy. 5 years earlier, Hannah's life had been forever altered when a drunk driver crossed the center line on Interstate 40, colliding head-on with her family's sedan. The crash claimed her father's life and left Hannah with a severe T12 spinal cord injury, permanently paralyzing her from the waist down. Since then, her mother, Diane, had been drowning in medical debt, working double shifts at a local diner just to keep the electricity on in their deteriorating double-wide trailer. Hannah, desperate to contribute and tired of feeling like a burden, spent her summers selling ice-cold bottled water and Gatorade to passing tourists heading toward the Colorado River. It wasn't much, a few crumpled dollar bills and quarters a day, but it was her way of fighting back against the crushing weight of their poverty. On this particular Tuesday, the highway was dead. The heat was so oppressive that even the cicadas had gone silent. Hannah was reading a paperback novel, a battery-powered fan clipped to her wheelchair's armrest, blowing warm air across her face, when the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural hum in the distance, quickly building into a deafening roar. Over the ridge came a pack of motorcycles, at least 30 of them, riding in a tight, disciplined formation. They wore heavy leather cuts, despite the lethal heat, emblazoned with the notorious winged death head. The Hells Angels. As they rumbled past, Hannah watched with a mix of awe and anxiety. The locals in Needles generally steered clear of outlaw motorcycle clubs. But as the main pack roared down the highway, disappearing into the heat distortion, one lone rider began to slow down. His massive, customized Harley-Davidson was sputtering, thick white smoke pouring from the exhaust. The rider, a mountain of a man with a graying beard and tattoos creeping up his neck, wrestled the heavy machine to the shoulder, coming to a halt barely 20 feet from Hannah's stand. He kicked the stand down and dismounted heavily. Even from a distance, Hannah could see he was in trouble. He swayed on his feet, tearing off his heavy leather vest and tossing it over the handlebars. His black t-shirt was soaked through with sweat. He stumbled toward the meager shade of a nearby billboard, his breathing ragged and shallow. Heat exhaustion in the Mojave was no joke. It could turn into fatal heat stroke in a matter of minutes. Hannah didn't hesitate. She grabbed the 2 coldest bottles of water from her cooler, placing them in her lap, and pushed the joystick on her wheelchair, navigating the bumpy, gravel-strewn shoulder. When she rolled up to him, the man looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was dangerously flushed. His knuckles were scarred, and the ink on his arms told stories of a violent, chaotic life. The name patch on his discarded vest read, Gage, S-Jet at Arms. "You look like you need this more than I need the $2, Hannah said, her voice steady as she held out a frosty bottle covered in condensation. Ronnie Gage Mitchell blinked, trying to focus his vision on the girl in the wheelchair. Outlaws like Gage were used to civilians crossing the street to avoid them. They were used to fear, judgment, and hostility. They were rarely on the receiving end of spontaneous, no-strings-attached kindness. He took the bottle with a trembling hand, unscrewing the cap and downing half of it in 3 massive gulps. He poured the rest over his head, the ice-cold water instantly providing relief to his overheating core. He let out a long, ragged exhale. "I thought I was a goner for a second," Gage grunted, his voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Engine overheated, and I pushed myself too hard trying to keep it running." He looked down at Hannah, really noticing her for the first time. He saw the worn grips on her wheelchair, the faded tires, and the undeniable kindness in her eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip, peeling off a crisp $50 bill. "Here, kid. Keep the change." Hannah shook her head, pushing his hand back gently. "No, I don't charge people for surviving. My dad used to say that when the desert tries to take you, we all have to look out for each other. Keep your money, Mr. Gage." Gage stared at her, stunned. He slowly put the money away. "It's just Gage," he said quietly. "What's your name?" "Hannah. Hannah Collins." Gage crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "Well, Hannah Collins, I owe you one. You ever need anything, you tell 'em Gage from the San Bernardino Charter sent you." He spent the next 20 minutes sitting in the dirt near her stand, letting his engine cool down while they talked. He didn't speak to her like a child, nor did he offer pity for her wheelchair, something Hannah deeply appreciated. Instead, they talked about the highway, the brutal heat, and the mechanical quirks of old engines. Once his bike was sufficiently cooled, Gage fired it up, gave Hannah a firm nod of respect, and roared off down Route 66 to catch his brothers. Hannah smiled, returning to her book. She thought that would be the end of it. She had no idea that her simple act of humanity was about to clash with a nightmare brewing in her own backyard. When Hannah returned to the trailer that evening, her mother was pacing the narrow linoleum-floored kitchen. Diane Collins looked exhausted, her uniform stained with coffee and grease. But today, panic was etched deeply into her features. "I saw them from the diner window, Hannah," Diane said, her voice trembling. "The bikers. And Mrs. Higgins told me one of them stopped at your stand. Are you out of your mind? You can't associate with people like that." "Mom, he was suffering from heat exhaustion," Hannah argued gently, navigating her chair into the cramped living space. "His bike broke down. I just gave him some water. He was actually really polite." Diane sighed, rubbing her temples. "You don't understand how the world works, honey. Men like that, they bring trouble. And we have enough trouble of our own." The truth of her mother's words crashed down on Hannah when a loud, aggressive knock rattled their thin front door. Before Diane could even answer, the door was pushed open. Standing on their rickety porch was Kenneth Boyd. Boyd was a local property manager and predatory lender who owned the land under their trailer, along with half the properties in the depressed county. He was notorious for squeezing vulnerable tenants out of their homes so he could sell the land to commercial developers building distribution warehouses. Boyd stepped inside without an invitation, wiping sweat from his balding head. He looked around the cramped trailer with a sneer of utter disgust. "Afternoon, Diane." "Hannah," Boyd said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I'm not going to beat around the bush. You're 4 months behind on the lot rent. Add in the late fees, and you're looking at $4,200. "Kenneth, please," Diane begged, stepping between him and Hannah. "I just picked up a 3rd shift at the diner. I can give you $800 on Friday, I swear." Boyd laughed, a dry, humorless sound. $800 doesn't even cover the interest on the late fees, Diane. I've been patient. I've been a saint, really. But business is business. The developers want this lot cleared by the end of the month." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and slapped it onto the kitchen counter. "This is a 48-hour notice to vacate, but we both know you can't move this rust bucket of a trailer." "We have nowhere to go," Diane cried, tears finally spilling over. "Please, Kenneth, you know about Hannah's medical bills. You know what happened to her father." Boyd's eyes narrowed, entirely devoid of empathy. "I do know. Which is why I also know you used your specially equipped Ford van as collateral on that loan you took from me last year." He pointed a thick finger at Hannah's wheelchair-accessible van parked outside. "If you don't have the 4200 by 9 a.m. on Friday, I'm taking the van, and I'm locking the doors to this trailer." "You can't take her van," Diane screamed. "It's the only way she can get to her physical therapy in Riverside. It has the hydraulic lift. We'll never be able to afford another one." "Watch me," Boyd snapped. He turned on his heel and walked out, letting the screen door slam loudly behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Diane collapsed into one of the cheap dining chairs, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Hannah sat frozen in her wheelchair, her heart pounding against her ribs. The van was her only lifeline to the outside world. Without it, she would be completely trapped. All the money she had saved from her water stand, barely $50, felt like an insulting joke compared to what they owed. The next 48 hours were a blur of desperation. Diane called every church, every charity, and every distant relative she could think of. The answers were always the same. "We wish we could help, but times are tough. We don't have that kind of money." Hannah didn't go out to the highway to sell water. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the dust blow across the yard, feeling the crushing weight of her disability more profoundly than she had in years. If she could walk, she could work a labor job. If she were whole, she could protect her mother. Friday morning arrived with a bleak, oppressive heat. At 8:55 a.m., a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck pulled into their dirt driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. Behind it was Kenneth Boyd's shiny silver Mercedes. Hannah wheeled herself out onto the porch, her mother standing beside her, trembling. Boyd stepped out of his car, flanked by a burly tow truck driver carrying a set of heavy chains. "Time's up, Diane," Boyd called out cheerfully. "Hook it up, Steve." "Kenneth, I am begging you on my hands and knees," Diane pleaded, stepping off the porch. "Take the trailer. Evict us. But leave the van. My daughter needs it." Boyd ignored her, waving the tow truck driver forward. Steve, looking slightly guilty but unwilling to lose his job, dragged the chains toward the front axle of Hannah's van. The hydraulic winch began to whine, the sound piercing Hannah's heart like a physical blade. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, tears of absolute helplessness streaming down her face. The chains clanked against the van's chassis. Boyd smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Should have paid your bills, Diane. The world doesn't run on charity." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Steve paused, the chains slipping from his hands. Boyd frowned, looking toward the highway. The noise was distant at first, like an approaching thunderstorm, but it grew louder with terrifying speed. It wasn't a storm. It was the synchronized thunder of American V-twin engines. Over the crest of the dirt road leading into the trailer park, a headlight appeared, then another, then 10, then 20. A massive convoy of Hell's Angels turned off the main road and rolled aggressively into the dusty lot of the trailer park. They didn't park on the street. They rode directly onto the sparse grass, forming a massive, intimidating steel semicircle that completely boxed in Boyd's Mercedes and the tow truck. The engines cut out in unison, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the stifling morning air. At the front of the pack, the mountain of a man with the graying beard kicked his stand down. Ronnie Gage Mitchell stepped off his bike, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't look overheated today. He looked cold, calculated, and deeply dangerous. Behind him, 24 patched members dismounted, standing silently with their arms crossed. Gage walked slowly past the terrified tow truck driver, ignoring Boyd completely. He walked right up to the porch, his eyes locking onto Hannah. "Morning, Hannah," Gage said, his deep voice carrying easily across the yard. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I heard you were having some car trouble." Hannah sat frozen, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sheer physical presence of the Hell's Angels in their dusty yard was overwhelming. The smell of hot engine oil and exhaust fumes mingled with the dry desert heat, creating an atmosphere thick with impending violence. Boyd, whose face had drained of all its arrogant color, took a hesitant step backward, bumping into the side of his pristine Mercedes. He swallowed hard, trying to project a non-existent authority. "Look here," Boyd stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know who you people are, but you are trespassing on private property. I want you off this lot right now, or I am calling the county sheriff." Gage didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on Hannah, offering her a warm, reassuring smile that completely contradicted the menacing skull patch on his leather vest. "You didn't answer my question, Hannah. Is this man bothering you?" "He's taking my van," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "My mom owes him money for the lot rent, and we used the van as collateral. He's taking it right now." Gage finally turned his massive frame toward Boyd. The air in the yard seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. The other bikers behind him shifted silently, forming a tighter perimeter around the tow truck. Steve, the tow truck driver, slowly raised his hands in surrender, carefully stepping away from the winch controls. $4,200, isn't it?" Gage asked softly. His voice didn't need volume to command absolute terror. It was the voice of a man who had survived things Boyd couldn't even fathom. Boyd wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. "Yes, that's the debt. Plus late fees. It's a legally binding contract. You can't just ride in here and interfere with lawful business. The sheriff will be here in 10 minutes if I make the call." "Make the call, Kenneth," a new voice chimed in. A younger biker, tall and wire-thin, with heavily tattooed forearms, stepped out from behind Gage. His cut bore the patch Caleb, road captain. Unlike the others, Caleb was holding a sleek leather folio. He flipped it open, pulling out a stack of documents. "Please dial the sheriff," Caleb continued, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. Because I'd love to show them these ledgers. See, Kenneth, after my brother Gage here heard about Hannah's situation from Martha Gable down at the diner, we did a little digging into your lawful business. Caleb walked forward and slapped a thick stack of papers onto the hood of Boyd's Mercedes. Boyd flinched, as if he had been struck. "What is this?" Boyd hissed, eyeing the papers. "That," Caleb said, tapping the top page, "is a detailed record of your predatory lending practices. You've been charging 45% compounding interest on personal loans tied to property leases. The state of California caps that at 10% for non-licensed personal lenders. You're committing felony usury, Kenneth. Furthermore, seizing a medically necessary vehicle from a documented disabled dependent without a formal court order is a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, combined with state extortion laws." Diane gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Hannah stared at Caleb in absolute shock. These weren't just outlaws. They were highly organized, and they had done their homework. Boyd's face shifted from pale white to a deep, mottled purple. "You're a bunch of criminal thugs. You think a judge is going to listen to a motorcycle gang over a respected property manager?" Gage chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed off the metal siding of the trailers. He reached into his heavy leather jacket and pulled out a thick, rubber-banded stack of $100 bills. He tossed it through the air. The brick of cash hit Boyd squarely in the chest, forcing him to catch it clumsily before it hit the dirt. "There's $5,000, Kenneth," Gage growled, stepping into Boyd's personal space. Gage was a full head taller, and his shadow completely engulfed the landlord. "That covers the rent, the fake late fees, and whatever imaginary interest you think you're owed. The debt is paid. The van stays." Boyd clutched the money, looking frantically from the cash to Gage's scarred face. "This doesn't change the eviction," Boyd spat, though he was shaking violently. "They still have to be off my property." "About that," Caleb interrupted, pulling one final document from his folio. "The parent company that owns this trailer park, Mojave Desert Holdings, we bought it this morning. The club was looking for a new commercial investment in the county. We wired the funds at 8 a.m. You don't own this land anymore, Kenneth. You're fired. And if you ever step foot near this family again, I won't be using a briefcase to deal with you." Gage leaned in closer to Boyd, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Unhook the van, get in your shiny car, and drive away before I forget that I'm trying to be a polite guest in Hannah's yard." Boyd didn't say another word. He practically scrambled away from Gage, clutching the cash to his chest. He shoved past Steve, diving into the driver's seat of his Mercedes. He threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning and kicking up a massive cloud of gravel as he fled the trailer park, nearly swiping a mailbox on his way out to the highway. Steve, the tow driver, immediately dropped the heavy chains in the dirt. "I'm unhooking it! I'm unhooking it right now! Swear to God!" he yelled, frantically disengaging the winch and tossing the chains back onto his flatbed. Within 30 seconds, the tow truck was gone, leaving the yard in absolute silence once again. Diane Collins collapsed onto her knees in the dirt, the adrenaline finally leaving her body. She began to sob uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands. Before Hannah could even maneuver her wheelchair forward, Gage was there. The massive biker gently knelt in the dust, wrapping a huge, leather-clad arm around Diane's shoulders, helping her to her feet. "It's okay, Mama," Gage said softly, his rough voice completely devoid of the menace he had just used on Boyd. "You're safe now. He's gone." Diane looked up at him, tears streaming down her exhausted face. I don't understand. Why did you do this? We don't have anything to give you. I can't repay you for this." "You already paid me," Gage said, turning to look at Hannah. "Your daughter saved my life on that highway. I was minutes away from a stroke, and she gave me the only water she had, and wouldn't take a dime for it. In my world, a debt of honor like that doesn't just go away. Gage stood up and whistled sharply. The rest of the club immediately sprang into action, but instead of pulling out weapons, they walked over to their saddlebags and began pulling out tool belts, hammers, cordless drills, and heavy-duty tarps. A burly biker named Duke walked up to the rickety, splintering wooden ramp that led to the trailer's front door. He kicked it once with his heavy boot, and a rotted plank cracked in half. "Yeah, this is a death trap, Gage," Duke grunted. "We're tearing this down." For the next 8 hours, the Hells Angels turned the Collins property into a massive construction site. Hannah and Diane sat in the shade of the canopy, completely bewildered, as 30 outlaw bikers repaired their home. Duke and Caleb led a team that completely dismantled the old, dangerous wheelchair ramp, rebuilding a state-of-the-art, low-incline ramp out of reinforced treated lumber, complete with safety rails. Another group climbed onto the roof of the double-wide, patching the leaks and sealing it against the harsh desert weather. A third group was working on Hannah's van, changing the oil, rotating the tires, and lubricating the hydraulic lift so it ran smoother than it had in years. By late afternoon, the brutal heat began to break, giving way to a beautiful purple Mojave sunset. Diane had made 3 pitchers of sweet tea, bringing out plastic cups to the bikers, who treated her with the utmost respect, calling her Mom and thanking her profusely. Gage sat down on a milk crate next to Hannah's wheelchair, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked at the new ramp, then looked at Hannah, looked at Toisu. "I have a confession to make, kid," Gage said quietly, his dark eyes softening. Hannah looked at him, sipping her tea. "You didn't really buy the trailer park, did you?" Gage laughed. "No, we actually did buy the park. Caleb wasn't bluffing about that. It's a good real estate investment, and we're officially your new landlords. But don't worry about the rent. You have a lifetime pass." Gage paused, looking down at his scarred hands. The heavy silence stretched between them for a moment. "The truth is," Gage began, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I rode past your stand the other day, I wasn't just overheated. I was hurting. It was the anniversary." "The anniversary of what?" Hannah asked gently. "Of the day I lost my daughter, Maya," Gage said, looking out toward the horizon. "She was exactly your age when she passed. When she was 12, she had a terrible accident. She was paralyzed, just like you. T10 spinal injury. My wife and I, we didn't have money back then. We couldn't afford the good physical therapy, the right equipment, the proper medical care. She got a bad infection, and because we lived in a run-down place with a landlord just like Kenneth Boyd, we couldn't keep her safe. She died." Hannah felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, gently placing her hand over Gage's massive tattooed knuckles. He didn't pull away. "When I broke down on that highway," Gage continued, a single tear escaping his eye and disappearing into his beard, "and I looked up and saw a beautiful, strong-willed girl in a wheelchair offering me her own water. It felt like Maya was looking right at me, telling me to wake up, telling me to stop being angry at the world and actually do something good for once." He turned his hand over, gently squeezing Hannah's fingers. "You didn't just give me water, Hannah. You gave me my heart back. Taking care of this house, taking care of you and your mom. It's the least I can do." The bikers finished their work just as the stars began to appear in the desert sky. The trailer was secure, the ramp was pristine, and the van purred like a kitten. As the club mounted their massive Harleys, Gage walked over to Diane and handed her a card with a single phone number on it. "You ever need anything? A light bulb changed, a ride to the hospital, or if anybody ever gives you a hard time, You call this number, day or night. You have 30 brothers looking out for you now. The engines roared to life, shaking the ground one last time. Gage gave Hannah a 2-finger salute, kicked his bike into gear, and led the pack back onto Route 66, their taillights fading into the warm desert night. A week later, the local news reported that Kenneth Boyd had been arrested by state investigators for felony fraud, extortion, and usury, facing up to 15 years in federal prison. The evidence had been anonymously mailed to the district attorney in a sleek leather folio. Hannah never had to sell water on the side of the highway again. With her housing secured and her medical debts mysteriously paid off by an anonymous donor in San Bernardino, she returned to college, studying to become a physical therapist. But every summer, without fail, a massive pack of Harleys would rumble through Needles, honking their horns as they passed the double-wide trailer, a roaring reminder that sometimes guardian angels wear black leather and ride on 2 wheels. If this incredible true story of unlikely kindness and fierce loyalty moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support Hannah's amazing spirit. Share this video with your friends to prove that you should never judge a book by its cover. And subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Hannah's place?